All right, welcome to another episode of my interview series. Today I'm talking with my friend Per Bylund. Per is a professor at Oklahoma State University. He is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute and an associate fellow of the Ratio Institute in his native Sweden. He's an expert in the Austrian School of Economics. He's written one of the best introductions to Austrian economics, How to Think About the Economy. And he is an astute observer of what's happening in America and Europe. Per, thank you for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
So you are Twitter famous or X.com famous for one of the best economic tweets in history, quoting, quote, "What causes poverty? Nothing. It is the original state, the default and starting point. The real question is what causes prosperity." So please explain that for listeners.
Well, I mean, the biggest problem, I think, in any discussion nowadays and also in science is that we're asking the wrong questions. And it's mostly more important to ask the right questions than to actually come up with a good answer. I like to twist things over a little bit and just to uncover what is the actual issue we're talking about. We tend to assume so much, and we tend to, in today's society, assume that there is plenty of wealth, so the problem is just how to spread it around, but wealth comes from somewhere. And it is the case that if you don't do anything, you're not going to have anything produced. And then you're going to have to, if you don't do anything at all, of course, you're just going to die. But even if you just rely on nature and don't do anything with nature, you're also going to probably die pretty soon. And you're definitely not going to be wealthy. So we have to ask, where does this prosperity that we're living in and that we're benefiting from and really enjoying every day, where does it come from? That's a real question. The question is not how come someone is poor, because that's a lack of prosperity, that's a lack of wealth. And the real question is, why are some countries and some nations rich and wealthy universally, and some countries are not? And how come they haven't caught up, and how can they catch up? Those are the main question, really, in economics.
And that's really a big distinction, I think, between mainstream and Austrian, is that mainstream economics tends to focus more on the distribution of wealth. Like it almost takes wealth as given, and then it focuses a lot on who's getting that wealth, income inequality, which kind of suggests almost a more political project, really, than an economics project. Like, which voting constituencies are we trying to appeal to? But in Austrian, the focus is much more on production. You're familiar, of course, with the Robinson Crusoe type. Do you, when you give your courses, sort of introducing students to Austrian theory or to economic theory in general, do you sort of go that route? Like, how do you explain to them how stuff is produced, how we get prosperity in the first place?
Yeah, I think you have to start from the beginning. And Robinson Crusoe is a good example, even though nowadays most students don't know what Robinson Crusoe is. So you have to talk about Tom Hanks in Castaway, and then they get it, which is sort of funny. It wasn't the case like 10 years ago, but now they don't really know what it is. But starting from the default point where you have nothing, and then talking about how can you accumulate wealth and by what means do you do that? I mean, that's super important, because for the individual person, like Robinson Crusoe alone, and also for society, where does it come from? And how come we experience growth, not GDP growth, but actual growth in terms of increased well-being? And where does it come from? How can we get more of it? How can we share it? Or what does it actually mean? Those are core important questions.
So what are the top policies in your mind that would increase wealth? Like if we look at today's America, for example, what kinds of policy changes do you think would have the biggest impact?
Well, I mean, one is to just lower the barriers to entry. So I think a lot of economists go wrong when they think about how competition is important and they count the number of businesses doing the same thing. Well, if they're doing the same thing, it's not going to contribute a whole lot to anything, but maybe making a specific production process more effective. But economic growth and actually creating wealth is about disrupting and creating new value. So having not stopping people and not stopping entrepreneurs from creating new businesses and new types of production is super important. And that we have a huge problem there. And I think the other one is to not mess with the important metrics that entrepreneurs can use in order to figure out whether something is valuable. So sound money is core there. So I would say those two things would solve a lot of the problems that we're seeing today.
And government, of course, sort of represents itself as a champion of the outsider. But Rothbard points out that I think pretty much every major regulation that has ever been imposed in the United States, including in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, these have been sponsored by big businesses, and those are represented to promote competition, but they do the opposite, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you can look at some recent examples where people on the political left even say, well, look at this. Even Amazon and Walmart are promoting and advocating for a higher minimum wage. And so it can't be that bad. How can it be so heartless, that sort of thing? Well, anyone with just the least bit of economic literacy can see that, well, they are incumbent firms. They're really big firms. They have a lot of what people call economic or financial muscle. They can take this extra cost because they already have their market niche. They already have demand. They already have recognition in the marketplace. They don't have to establish themselves and sort of become a legitimate actor in the marketplace, because everybody knows what Walmart is. Everybody knows what Amazon is. What they would benefit from, though, is to not have a new Walmart come in and completely undermine Walmart, or a new Amazon to completely undermine Amazon. And how do you stop them? Well, you artificially raise their costs. So you cannot hire anyone under $15 or $25 or $50 an hour or whatever. Amazon can eat that cost and stay in business much longer because a startup can never cover those costs. And this goes also to, it's not only the cost, it's also regulations, right? That very often would force them to have employees with a salary rather than to have them as co-founders and that sort of thing. And you can't work for free, and you can't use interns and whatever it might be, right? In a startup, the biggest problem, the number one problem, is to break even, because you always have costs before you have revenues. So if you then raise potential future competitors' costs, well, they have to eat those costs before they can break even, which means it's much, much, much harder to actually enter the market and become a threat to these businesses. So of course they would lobby for higher minimum wage, not because they care about people, because they can just raise the wages of their employees if they want to. But what they instead do is they go through government so that everybody will have to, which tells you that it's not in pure goodness that they want people to earn more money. It is that they see something else as a potential result of it, right? And that potential result most obviously is no higher barriers to entry and no future competition.
That's really one of the slickest gaslights probably of the century, where regulation has been framed as this anti-corporate policeman type action, when really this is just pure corruption, literally bought by the corporations and then applied to their competitors. Now, you said that most mainstream economists don't understand the basics of the economy, even though they, quote, produce sophisticated models for a living. They do. They're very, very good at math. But I agree with you. They don't understand the fundamentals. So what are some of the basics that even Ph.D. or even professional economists are missing?
Well, I mean, the number one would be simply that the economy is a process and it's cumulative. And what is missing from when you teach basic economics and also in all these models, well, it's the process. It's the evolution, the change, the dynamics. So you have the supply and demand chart of the whole economy or an industry or for a business or what have you, but it's static. And yes, you can calculate optimum or maximization and what have you, given that nothing else changes. But in the real economy, you have this thing called entrepreneurship that constantly revolutionizes production and revolutionizes the world for consumers. because entrepreneurs typically step ahead. They're the trailblazers, and they produce these new goods and services that even consumers don't know that they might benefit from. And then when they see them, consumers go, holy smokes, I want one of those. And an example that I use in class that it's getting dated, but it's just the smartphone, because nobody in college, they don't remember a time before the smartphone anymore. But what was the first iPhone? Well, everybody was competing with having the smallest phone that you could possibly produce, and smaller and smaller and smaller and lighter and lighter and lighter. And it was only a phone. Well, you could sort of text on it and things like that. And then Steve Jobs had the idea, well, let's make a big ass phone instead. That doesn't have any buttons. It's just one big screen. And the first generation, it was pretty crappy. You couldn't really place phone calls on it because it dropped the calls and stuff like that. The internet was really bad and stuff like that. But it opened a new world of possibilities for consumers, and consumers were like, wow, this is fantastic. And had he asked people if what they wanted, they would have said, I want an even smaller phone, right? Just like the quote, the Henry Ford quote, which I use a lot, but it's obviously not a quote. But he said that had I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Because we're sort of stuck in what we do and what we have around us, so we don't think about what are the options. If someone would just be a little bit more imaginative and think about how to satisfy consumers in a different way. And Steve Jobs did that with the iPhone, and Henry Ford did that with the affordable Model T. And there are plenty of examples of this throughout history, of course. And if you add this component to the economy, it becomes an evolving, an unfolding of process that is nothing really like the supply and demand graph.
A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes if used correctly. With Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've recently seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Go to Unchained.com and save $1,745 on an IRA using promo code AUGUSTIRA. That's AUGUSTIRA. Now back to our show. Yeah, and that's brilliant. I also use literally the iPhone when I was teaching entrepreneurship as well. And for that exact reason, right? That, Steve Jobs' genius was knowing what people want better than they did. He wasn't particularly good at tech. He copied everything significant, including the iPhone. Every element of the iPhone was copied. However, what he was really, really good at was he knew better than the customer. And you can say that for Elon Musk as well, right? He keeps coming out with things that people had no idea they want. Before Tesla, there was not a raging demand for electric vehicles. Neuralink, Hyperlink, or Hyperloop, none of these things are addressing existing consumer needs. They're just, he thinks they're cool. He has a kind of mind where he can see into consumers' preferences, and a lot of these things work out fantastically. And mainstream economics sort of starts from that point where everything is just falling out of the sky. You've got these products, they just, it's like a cargo cult, they fell out of a plane, and now we get to optimize the industry. But of course, the optimization is a very, very small part of prosperity, right? The vast majority of it is this trial and error process that you've talked about a lot. This is one of your core research areas, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's so much here to unpack, really, and how modern economics has it's deviated from and strayed from economics the way it used to be when it was trying to understand what is going on in the economy and where does wealth come from and all these important questions, to now instead be about tweaking policies to measure results and that sort of thing. And they do miss a lot of what is actually going on because they don't have an entrepreneur. There's no such thing as entrepreneurship in economics. It's a separate field, which is sometimes bundled with management, which doesn't make any sense at all. Whereas it should be really a part of, or a core part of, core specialization of economics, because that is what creates the whole process. But economists have, for the past 100+ years really turned their backs on how the economy itself works, and instead they are playing math games and using huge databases to figure out how to plan the economy. I mean, that's basically what economists do, right? They're central planners pretending to be scholars, if you will.
Yeah, and once you take out the entrepreneur, then every profit sort of becomes dirty. Like it becomes this scam. Like you've taken it from other people, because failing to recognize any kind of value in entrepreneurship. Well, then why should Steve Jobs make more money than anybody else at Apple, right? How do you think that happened? Like what was kind of the moment, or maybe the individual scholar who really killed the entrepreneur in sort of mainstream economics?
Well, I think there are several suspects, but I think a big part of it is the creation of macroeconomics as a separate field. Or, I mean, nowadays to teach economics, you teach micro or macro. There's no such thing as economics itself. It's always micro or macro, and they're separate courses, and there's no way of combining them because they're based on different assumptions. So, I mean, if you want one guy who was definitely guilty, then it's John Maynard Keynes, who was, in a sense, with his general theory, trying to kill off economics, because economics realized a lot of things about the economy, making it very, very difficult for the state to expand without causing enormous harm on people's universal wealth, on prosperity. Whereas if you look at, as Keynesian and all macroeconomists basically nowadays do, if you look at only aggregate statistics and work on how the statistics correlate, then of course you don't need to discuss the process at all, and you can make up all kinds of fancy theories on how aggregate supply and aggregate demand, they work together, or if one breaks loose and all this other stuff, and you can create these myths of how the economy might work on an aggregate level. And you even have a lot of people really nowadays in macroeconomics claiming that, well, there are no micro foundations for macro phenomena. So yes, there is aggregate demand and there is a monetary policy and so forth. But what people do is not necessarily what leads to these aggregates of what they do, which doesn't make any sense at all. But they start from the top, much like sociologists and central planners, instead of from the bottom up, as economists have basically always done.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. That, right, economics traditionally has been extremely hostile to government action. That's the dismal science claim, which is that government policy guys would come to the economists and they say, hey, I got this great idea. Is it going to work? And the economists keep saying, no, that's not going to work. And that's an excellent point you make, that, essentially they took the entrepreneur out because they had to take this field that had centuries of conclusions that were hostile to government intervention, and they had to run this thing through a wood chipper so that out the other side they could get something that somehow justified their stupid ideas for interfering in the economy. So yeah, no, that's fantastic. And for listeners who aren't familiar, so broadly speaking, and Per, correct me if I'm wrong, my image is that microeconomics is much closer to classical economics. So the tools there, it uses actually a lot of Austrian tools. Marginal analysis, time is more of a factor. So micro is sort of the more pure version of economics, and macro is more or less just state propaganda. There's almost nothing in there that's theoretically sound. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I would, because microeconomics is definitely closer to classical economics and the way economics has been before. Unfortunately, a lot of microeconomists use a lot of math and modeling like that, so they too do not include the entrepreneur, for instance. They talk about business formation, perhaps, and they talk about market structure in terms of how many small businesses are there in a certain industry, and that would make it more agile and dynamic versus a more mature industry where you have many big businesses and things like that. But they wouldn't really have the creative aspects of entrepreneurship, so they don't have that unfolding because math doesn't allow for it. I mean, if you have any mathematical function or any graph over supply and demand and take anything basically, then ask the economist or whoever, where is the entrepreneur in this? Where do you fit entrepreneurship? Well, it's the basic assumption that there is none, because then you can't fit it in there, because in a sense, entrepreneurship is the error term in any equation. Right. And the error term in this case is what drives the change of all the other variables. And how can you explain anything if you mathematize it and you say, well, all the explanation is in the error term? Well, that doesn't mean anything at all. That just means that you're completely out of line.
Yeah, and in a sense, the mistake is going to be built into the process. Once you try to reduce an economy to equations, anything that is hard to predict, random, the difference between Steve Jobs being an Apple versus not an Apple, like how do you model that? You can't model it. It's too large, it's too unpredictable, it can overwhelm everything else. And so one reaction is to stand back and say, well, maybe a math equation is not the way to represent entrepreneurial competition. And the other way is just to drop the misbehaving variable and just say, well, here, let's just drop that out of it, and let's just pay attention to everything else there. That's the old joke about losing the keys in the parking lot, and the guy's looking for him here. You say, where did you lose your keys? Way over there. Well, why aren't you looking over there? Because the light's better here, and the light is better, unfortunately, with the math. And so that's sort of taken over, I think, modern microeconomics. And that's one of the criticisms of Austrian. Sort of mainstreamers make fun of Austrian economics because they say, you guys don't use any math. And so is that a fair accusation? And why does Austrian rely less on math?
Well, I mean, it is from their perspective, I guess, because to them, there's only math and empirical data. And then they use that in order to theorize, whereas economics has traditionally been deductive rather than inductive. So, I mean, it's theorizing first so that we can uncover what the heck is going on and then measure stuff, right? So by already having a theory of what causes such disruptions that create, say, a business cycle, by already having that theory, we can identify what actually happened and say exactly how did the Great Depression come about, because we can figure out which are the variables we should look at, when should they have been, when can we find them, and sort of thing, and things like that. Because what we're talking about is the social world, right? The economy sounds like it's just numbers and it's raw data and stuff like that, but it's not. It's based on people's subjective valuation. And subjective valuation you can't measure. What you can measure is the price they're paying for something. But the price they're paying is limited by the value they expect, which is subjective, and also the value they expect from alternative uses of their money. And of course, also adjusted to how easy is it for them to make more money. Well, all of those are their own personal judgment based on subjective value. So those are not really data in themselves. They're data on a social level if you aggregate them up, but they don't really tell us anything about these things at all. And then you would end up with these strange problems in analyzing these things. And Schumpeter, which is a fun example here, was sort of the prophet of innovation. He was schooled in the Austrian tradition, but became sort of a mainstreamer. He started out with talking about how the economy is sort of a circular flow, and how entrepreneurs break out of this circular flow by creating more value. They realize that they can create much more value using the resources available, which, fine, I can agree with that. And then he said, well, that means we have to let banks create additional credit so that entrepreneurs can get the purchasing power to buy the resources from the people who have the resource and use them in production. Well, that doesn't follow at all, because if you think that what you're doing is much more valuable in the marketplace, you already have the purchasing power, because that is the limit to how much you can offer to pay for the resources. Right? So you already have that. It sort of puts the cart before the horse, because the problem is that the value is the end point of all the production. It is what motivates and justifies all the decisions, and the cost of it is based off of everybody else's valuations. So by being an entrepreneur, thinking that I can create a whole lot of value, just like you mentioned with Steve Jobs, no new types of components, no invention really, but innovation, new value. So he just put them together in a new way. And because he did that, he realized that this is going to be such great value that I can charge like $1 million per phone, whereas no one else can. That allows me to buy the best. I can hire the best people. I can buy the best materials. I can use the best machines. I can invest more in design to make sure that this new thing, this new gadget, it feels like it's of great quality and is really fun to use and that sort of thing. Whereas if you don't create a whole lot of value, you can't afford to do that.
A word from our sponsor. If you're looking for a podcast that cuts through the noise and delivers honest, truthful, and conservative perspectives, check out the Daily Signal podcast. Each weekday, they bring you interviews with policymakers on the issues that matter most. From breaking down complex legislation to exposing media bias, they're committed to giving you the facts you won't hear from the establishment media. Subscribe now to the Daily Signal podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Now back to the show. So metaphorically, mainstream economists, they might be looking at two restaurants. They look at a McDonald's and they look at a Michelin 3-star restaurant. And they say, wait a second, tomatoes cost this much, bread costs that much, beef costs this much, and McDonald's is selling it for this. The Michelin restaurant is selling it for that. They're completely mystified why. Maybe it's exploitation, maybe it's deception, maybe it's false consciousness by the consumer. Because almost all of the value being created is something that you cannot quantify. It's in the heads of the consumer. You have interplay with, the entrepreneurs have to guess what the consumer wants. The entrepreneur also knows that he has other options in life. There are all of these things, none of which can actually be measured, right? All of it is happening in the head. And then these mainstream economists, of course, you can't put things that you don't know into an equation. You'll just have a bunch of big variables. And, you certainly can't put two in there or it breaks. You have no idea what's happening. They're blind. And so it's the guy with the keys under the light, right? They're completely blind, but it's very important for them to maintain the illusion that they know what's happening when all these things are unknowable.
Right. And I think with the restaurant example, what they would do is try to measure the quality of the inputs. So they say, well, the Michelin restaurant has much more expensive meat and the buns are made out of seeds that are grade A and not grade B or whatever, all of those things. But they don't realize that those are the results of expecting that the burger from the Michelin restaurant is going to be much more valuable to consumers. That's why they can afford these inputs. It's not the inputs that create the value. It's the other way around, right? So obviously they're going to find a big difference still, even if they measure the higher quality of the beef and whatever. They're still going to find a difference. Well, the only solution then is to say, well, these are different kinds of restaurants, different industries.
Right, exactly. They just kind of give up at that point. They say, well, it's a different industry. All right, so switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a bit about what's happening in America at the moment. So one of the hallmarks of Austrian, which I think is one of the things that's very appealing to both of us, is that we pay a lot more attention to history, economic history. And almost everything that governments screw up has been done many, many times before. And so we can actually see the results. But in your mind, so what's happening in America right now? Like, how did we get here? How did we screw up? And what do you think is coming next?
Yeah, that's a small question with a simple answer. No, I mean, there's so much that is wrong, right? So one is that America is a fundamentally corporatist system. So there's basically a constant bidding in Washington, D.C. for laws and privileges and special favors and things like that. And of course, politicians, they eagerly enjoy getting part in this and sell these services too. So people are not really aware of how much this lobbying is going on and how many of these laws are really written by lobbyists for some special interest. And then there's a lot of dealing. I think you can, though, if you want to draw a line in history where things started to go down the tubes, it's 1913, when the Federal Reserve was founded, and when money started to become a tool for the government rather than an actual market institution, even though it was sort of minted by the government. And we see that money today, a dollar today, is not worth much at all compared to a dollar back then. And this, of course, has created a lot of problems in the economies, a lot of distortions, a lot of malinvestments, if you will. But I think the major issue here is that because the banking system and the Federal Reserve, the central bank, is creating all these new dollars so that the government can spend them into existence, as MMTers say. What this means is that it's a huge ongoing redistribution of wealth. And I mean, if you want to simplify it a little bit, it's taking from Main Street and giving to Wall Street. And I include the political class in Wall Street, right? So we're seeing a great and impoverishment, really, of regular Americans because of this. So had they been making money still in gold or silver dollars, it would be very different, and government would not be able to borrow all this money. They wouldn't be able to spend this much more than their revenue and things like that, because they would be tied to a unit, monetary unit, and a means of exchange that doesn't and can't be constantly devalued or inflated by the government itself. So, I mean, in the U.S.'s case, this has worked out, quote unquote, simply because the U.S. is big and mighty, militarily speaking and economically speaking. So many of these dollars flee the country. So people are using dollars in other countries. So you can create a whole lot more dollars before you see the effect at home. And that, I mean, those are chickens coming home to roost eventually. And then we're going to see a huge problem, because then we get, who knows if we might see hyperinflation and when. I mean, that's impossible to say. It's probably overvalued, though, the dollar, compared to what it should be if the dollars were all here and not were sitting in people's banks accounts and banks' reserves, both here and abroad, and that sort of thing. And of course, with 1913, we got the IRS and all this stuff too. So a lot of things went wrong in a few years there.
Yeah, it was kind of the worst year in American history for sure. Just everything collapsed at once. And, you know, when you talk about the concentration of wealth, so you see these lists every year of the richest zip codes in America. And consistently you have 3 cities that feature on that list. One of them is San Francisco, where, you know, you have tech, which is a very winner-takes-all industry. There's very strong network effects. It's kind of understandable why tech would accrue so much wealth. But then the other 2 that you have there are New York and Washington, D.C. So New York arguably destroys as much as it creates, finance in other words. Washington creates absolutely nothing. There is no industry whatsoever in Washington. There's like, I don't know, there's some cows out in Maryland. There's nothing they produce there of value. They're just middlemen. And so it's striking, right? It's like Hunger Games at some point.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you're right. I thought maybe you would say that there is some kind of production in D.C., but I'm not aware of what it is. They have a lot of bureaucrats, sure, but bureaucrats aren't really value creative much. So that's hardly a reason for the wealth. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that money is flowing into D.C. from elsewhere, and it's not because D.C. is exporting goods and services people want to buy. That's simply not the case, right? So it's an extraction. So in a sense, I mean, how would you make the U.S. Free and prosperous in just one strike of the pen? Well, you just get rid of D.C. and say that, well, you're on your own, you're not part of the United States anymore. And, well, then the other states will have to find their own way, but that would be a whole lot better, probably, and a lot of institutional competition and that sort of thing, too. But there wouldn't be this enormous extraction.
I completely agree. Now, on money, so you mentioned earlier that, there's the prospect of hyperinflation. How do you see it ending based on history, based on what's happening at the moment? Can we return to hard money without a crisis, or do you think it's going to take a crisis?
Yeah, I wish I knew. And I wish I knew the timing of it too, because then I could be a very rich man in the future. The problem is the timing, because theory doesn't really give us any insight into when, only that you see all these problems everywhere and all these malinvestments and distortions that are rampant. I'm not sure. It depends a little bit on what day you ask me how optimistic I am about the outcome. I think in general, I'm a political scientist back in the day too, and I think that change can happen through the government and through reform, and it did in Sweden, for instance, but only when the political class is basically forced by circumstance. So when they have to, they might actually do something good. And they did in Sweden when Sweden was bankrupted and imploded pretty much in 1992. All the parties sat down and they said, okay, we need to do something. And they all agreed, let's cut taxes, let's cut the welfare state, and let's pay back the national debt. And they did that for some 15, 20 years. And that of course, created a huge difference. But it was only because, well, either this or everything is just going to crash down. So it means that you're really close to the crash. But I don't think there is a soft landing in the sense that, we can just tamper with a few data here and there and change a policy here and there, and then things will just work themselves out. We can kick the can down the road, sure, but it's a snowballing effect too. It's not actually a can, so it's going to get bigger.
Every week I write a free article on the hot topics in economics with regular deep dives into history like the fall of Rome, the Weimar hyperinflation, FDR's Great Depression, and the 1970s Nixon shock. It's free, so check it out at www.profstonge.com, profstonge.com. Now back to our show.
In terms of the moving to a sound currency, I think that is more of an issue that is in line with agorism rather than political reform, meaning simply that people themselves will start to save in other types of currencies and other types of money. So both crypto and gold coins and what have you, and save for a rainy day, pretty much. And then maybe when prices start going up or keep going up, they will realize that, wait a minute, I'm actually making a lot here, because these things, they retain their purchasing power, whereas the money in my bank account, they do not. And then they will probably transition more and more to these things, and people will probably adopt to use other types of monies than dollars at the same time as they're using dollars for other types of transactions.
And we see this in poor countries today, right? So in Mexico, if you're a rich Mexican, your life savings are not in Mexico pesos. You're not that dumb, right? To the extent you have cash and your long-term holdings, those are US dollars. You keep some Mexican pesos, 2-3 months, expenses, pay the maid, pay the grocery bill, but you're saving dollars. And then, of course, if you're in the US, what you're mentioning, right, the agorism or sort of the lifeboat model where people save themselves. If you've held gold since the 1970s, you've done fine, right? You have not lost purchasing power. I believe that gold has more or less performed in line with stocks, which you actually wouldn't expect because it's not being loaned out at interest and doesn't have risk. But it's actually held up comparable to stocks, certainly during COVID, when both have gone up quite a bit. And then, of course, Bitcoin or crypto have been a whole another story. They've gone up so much that they're actually drawing people in for price alone, right? Gold tends to be because people philosophically understand the role of gold, not necessarily because it's going up. But right, Bitcoin is, especially for young people, is pretty appealing. Like if you've got a buddy who retired at 25 on Bitcoin, this can start to cast questions on your, CD down at the bank, whether you should do something else with it.
Yeah, and I think this is the whole motivation for a CBDC too. That you want to control not only the money and decide legally that this is supposed to be the money because people can escape that. But with the CBDC, you can force their hand in every transaction and in everything they do. And that's sort of the point. I mean, that's what the Bank of England put in their report as one of the benefits of a digital currency that they control, right? That they can micromanage each pound. Basically, they can say whether it should exist or not and what you can use it on and things like that.
What do you think the odds are? So my sort of base case has been that the next recession we get, they're going to try to bring in a universal basic income, and that would be a golden opportunity to bring in a CBDC because you can claim that it's easier to administer the UBI. What do you think the odds are, I guess, first of that sequence, but secondly, are we doomed to a CBDC? Are they going to stop? Public opinion hates it, but this thing just keeps rolling. Do you think it's what are the odds that we're going to get one or both of those, UBI and CBDC?
I don't know. Had you asked me a few years ago, I would have said that the UBI would be inevitable pretty much. But they have tried it in several places. And the so-called success stories that they report are pretty far from any kind of success. Yeah. They point to some of the people who were part of the experiments, how they gained a little bit. But sure, you're paying people for not doing anything. So, of course, it gained some. But the problem is, how does this affect the economy? And I think one of the success stories that I read was from Finland, where they had a limited experiment, where one of the examples that they upheld as a reason for maybe expanding the experiment, or at least this report is also, was that there was this one guy who loved to produce drums at home. And it was a business that he couldn't make a living off of doing, but with UBI, he could spend some of his time, just loafing on the couch, and some of his time producing these drums and then sell them. But he couldn't produce enough, of course, to live off of this, and he didn't probably want to work as much either, and of course he wanted to produce the drums that he wanted to produce and not for anyone either. So the success story was that he could work with what he loves doing and still make a living, or not make it, but have a living. And this to me is not really a success story, because if you understand anything about the economy, what you're doing here is that, you're letting the guy have a hobby, which he could have otherwise too, and then you're giving him a handout so that he can live off just doing his hobby without actually providing any value into the economy or society. Now, that is definitely not a recipe for prosperity or a better future. That's consumption of the value that we already have. It's not adding to it.
Yeah, so he's sort of giving a middle finger to everybody else in the world and saying, screw you, I don't care what you want. I'm just going to do the stuff I want. But yeah, no, I agree. It's completely prosperity destroying. Now, I want to ask you about your book, because I have heard about this everywhere. I've had people on Twitter, X, who have suggested it as a good way to learn about the economy for newcomers. So it's called How to Think About the Economy. And you wrote this a while back. When did you publish this?
2022. So it's a couple of years old.
2022. And so who's the book aimed at? And especially for parents who might be listening, sort of take us through some of the core concepts for teaching kids about the world, to sort of counter programs some of what public schooling does.
Sure. I mean, the problem I've had for a long time is that people ask me, what is the one thing I should read to just get up to date and get some economic literacy and that sort of thing. And I mean, there are plenty of introductory books and introductions to economics and things like that. But they're usually very expensive if they're published by an academic publisher, or they focus on a certain thing. So the standard reference has been Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And the problem with that book is that, at least to me, is that it is one lesson. It's just the same lesson over and over and over again for 30 plus chapters until maybe you get opportunity cost by now. Right, but you can't really apply it to all these other things. And where do business cycles come from? What does money mean? All those things, they're not really in this book. And don't get me wrong, it's a great book, but it's still not enough to get sort of an overview. So I discussed with Jeff Dice, who was then the president of the Mises Institute, and sort of suggested that someone should do this. And then, of course, he suggested that maybe I should do it, which was not the point I was trying to make in a way. And so we agreed that I should try to do it, and we set some expectations on the product, which was this should be broad enough to cover the whole economy and why we should understand the economy. It should be half as long as Hazlitt's book, and it should be written in the same type of language. It should be easy to understand, no jargon, nothing like that, no math, no graphs, nothing like that. Right? So just text, simple explanations, which was really hard to put together, but I think I did a decent job doing it. And now it's published and it's available now, I think, in 8 languages. There are about a dozen more languages coming. It's available on Amazon, of course, but you can buy it from the Mises Institute, and I think now they charge you $0 for it. So basically, you pay for shipping. And to me, in order to just get an idea of how the heck do you write something like this, what is the audience? And what I had in mind always was, what if some kid is sort of read up on all this stuff online and chats with the family and basically bores them to death with all this economic stuff around Thanksgiving dinner or something like that. Then grandma would probably say, well, little John, could you tell me more about this, or where do you get these ideas? And then he should be able to say, well, here, grandma, read this book. It will only take like a couple of hours of your time. You will definitely understand it, and then you know what I'm talking about, right? So that was sort of my target audience. Not that I'm trying to sell it to only grandmas, but it should be a book that you could actually hand to grandma, and grandma would understand it. So in order to do that, I mean, I wrote plenty of drafts just to try to get it right, but I divided the book into 3 sections. And the first one is really on what the heck is economics, why at all study the economy, what does it mean, what the heck is an economy? Because we talk about it all the time, but no one really seems to be able to define it. And then the second and sort of main part of the book talks about the economy. So it talks about how it is a process and not a factory for producing output. It's a process that evolves and changes the outputs over time, and the role of value and things like that. And then I get into interventions in the last couple of chapters. There's business cycles, there's monetary interventions, and also regulations. What are the actual effects? What can we say about them? And then how can we trace the effects of it? And I mean, it is short. I had students tell me that they could read it in less than 3 hours, just cover to cover.
No, that is great. I completely agree. There's a need for a kind of a gateway drug to bring people into the field, to give them an overview. A lot of people are intimidated by economics, I think intentionally. I think they dress it up with jargon, like quantitative easing. Why do they have to invent new words for that? Pretty simple concept. A lot of these things are simple concepts where they invent words for it, and you're kind of skeptical why exactly they saw that need. So that's fantastic. And I'm going to have links here when it's showing up. But for those who are listening on the podcast, they can get it at Mises.org and also, I suppose, at Amazon.com.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Okay. I have been talking with Per Bylund. How can people follow your work?
They can do so on X or Twitter, where the handle is just my name, and I'm spend way too much time there, if you ask my wife. So I'm there pretty much every day. Yeah, well, that is true. But I use that account not only to I comment on economics, and I make sort of statement on economic truths, but I also use it to debate with people. So when people ask questions, I respond, and I discuss with them as well, which of course it attracts a lot of trolls and people who just want to get me or something. But I do try to take the time to respond to people, and when people have serious questions, it's sort of a free economic support.
All right, Per, thank you for coming on. I've enjoyed it. Let's do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersaintonge.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.